What most patrons couldn't see, beneath the weathered exterior and humble demeanor, was the history etched into every line of Robert Ellis's face. Each wrinkle told a story of sacrifice few would ever comprehend. He chose this restaurant every Veterans Day not for convenience, but for a promise made decades ago in the humid darkness of a Vietnam night. The prosthetic leg that caused his distinctive gait had been with him longer than his natural one had been. The metal and plastic appendage was outdated now, a relic from another era when medical technology did what it could for those who returned altered from distant conflicts. Robert had learned to live with its limitations, just as he'd learned to live with the memories that visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream create spiral patterns before dissolving. The restaurant hummed with life around him, families laughing, friends reconnecting, couples leaning close across tables, while Robert sat in his own pocket of solitude. He preferred it this way. After years of chaos and noise, of jungle humidity and radio static, silence had become his most trusted companion. The tattoo on his wrist had faded over the decades, once sharp lines now blurred by time and sunlight. It wasn't the standard military insignia that people recognized from movies or recruiting posters. The dagger through an anchor was something special, a symbol designed by 8 men who had formed a bond stronger than blood in circumstances few civilians could imagine. As far as Robert knew, he might be the last one alive who carried it. His gnarled fingers traced the outline of the tattoo unconsciously, a habit formed through thousands of quiet moments when memories surface without warning. Today, the touch was deliberate, a silent communication with those who were no longer here to sit across from him. From his corner table, Robert could observe the entire restaurant. The skills that had once helped him navigate hostile territory still served him well in civilian life, always aware of exits, always noting who entered, always assessing potential threats. Old habits died hard, even when the only danger now was the occasional disrespect from those who couldn't see beyond the surface. The restaurant had changed since James had shown him that faded photograph all those years ago. New paint, different furniture, updated menus, but the bones of the place remained the same. The large windows still let in streams of morning light, the ceiling still had those distinctive wooden beams, and the smell of coffee and breakfasts still filled the air just as James had described it. Best burgers in New Holland, James had insisted, pulling the crumpled photo from his pocket during a rare quiet moment at base camp. When we get home, first rounds on me. Robert sipped his water, maintaining his ritual despite the memories pressing against his chest. He never ordered a burger during these visits. That would have seemed like completing the promise without James. Instead, he ordered the simplest breakfast on the menu, leaving an empty chair across from him, as if saving it for someone who would never arrive. The food before him was growing cold, but Robert wasn't particularly hungry anyway. His presence here wasn't about nourishment for the body, but for something deeper. A connection to a past that grew more distant with each passing year, yet never less vivid in his mind. "Look at that," the third man at the center table whispered, nudging his companion and nodding toward Robert's prosthetic leg. "Probably lost it to diabetes, not combat." "My uncle was a Marine," the fourth added with unknown authority. "Real veterans don't sit alone. They join the VFW and wear their caps. This guy's just looking for sympathy." Robert heard every word despite their lowered voices. His hearing, remarkably sharp for a man his age, was another remnant of his training. In the dense jungles where visibility extended mere feet, ears became the primary sensors. Even now, decades later, he could filter conversations across a crowded room, a skill that often brought more pain than benefit. He focused instead on the worn photograph hidden in his wallet. The snapshot showed 2 young men in sweat-stained t-shirts, arms thrown over each other's shoulders, standing before a half-assembled radio unit. Their faces bore the mixture of exhaustion and alertness common to those operating in constant danger. Yet there was unmistakable camaraderie in their eyes. James had been the better-looking one, tall with an easy smile that somehow remained intact despite everything they'd witnessed. Robert had been the quiet one even then, serious and methodical, already showing signs of the man he would become. The breakfast special today wasn't much: scrambled eggs, toast, a small portion of hash browns. But it cost exactly what Robert had budgeted for this annual pilgrimage. His modest pension covered his basic needs, but there was little room for luxuries. The auto repair shop he'd run for 30 years had provided a comfortable living until arthritis claimed the precision of his hands and rising property taxes forced him to close. Now, each expense required careful calculation. A young family settled at the table next to him, their toddler immediately dropping a colorful toy that rolled to rest against Robert's prosthetic. The mother looked over, embarrassment crossing her face as she noticed the metal leg. "I'm so sorry," she began, rising to retrieve the toy. Robert smiled genuinely for the first time that morning. No trouble at all. He carefully bent down, lifting the toy with fingers that moved slower than they once had, and held it out to the child. The little boy took it without hesitation, offering a gap-toothed smile in return. "Thank you, mister." The mother nodded gratefully before turning back to her family, the brief interaction already forgotten. But for Robert, these small moments of normal human connection were precious counters to the whispers and stares. Nearby, a television mounted on the wall silently displayed morning news. Closed captions scrolled across footage of modern military operations, young men and women in desert camouflage, equipment far more advanced than anything Robert had known. He watched for a moment, wondering how many of those fresh faces would return changed in ways visible and invisible. How many would someday sit alone in restaurants, carrying memories most civilians couldn't comprehend? The men at the center table had moved on to discussing sports, their earlier commentary about Robert apparently exhausted. Their laughter rose above the restaurant's ambient noise as one of them told an exaggerated story about a fishing trip. Robert didn't begrudge them their happiness or even their ignorance. The world moved forward. That was the natural order. Those who served did so precisely so others could live unburdened by the realities that shattered veterans like himself. His gaze drifted to the window, where American flags lined the street for the holiday. Beyond them, he could see the town square where a small ceremony would take place later. Speeches would be given, wreaths laid, moments of silence observed. Robert never attended these official remembrances. His tributes were private, measured in quiet moments and personal rituals. The eggs on his plate had grown completely cold now, but he methodically finished every bite. Waste was something his generation understood differently. Each forkful was mechanical, an act of discipline rather than pleasure. His thoughts were already drifting back to that night in 1971, the helicopter blades pulsing overhead, the radio crackling with coordinates as he fought to stay conscious long enough to guide them in, despite the searing pain in what remained of his leg. Robert gathered his strength, leaning heavily on the worn wooden cane that had been his companion for nearly 2 decades. The previous one, a military-issue aluminum model, had finally given out after 30 years of faithful service. This replacement was a gift from a customer whose son's bicycle Robert had fixed without charge, an unexpected kindness that still touched him when he remembered it. Standing was a choreographed process: shift weight, position cane, adjust prosthetic, rise carefully. Each movement executed with precision born from thousands of repetitions. The prosthetic socket pinched slightly, as it always did after he'd been sitting too long, but Robert's face betrayed nothing. Pain had long ago become just another sensation to be acknowledged and managed, like hunger or cold. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer some assistance, sir?" the server asked, noticing his careful movements. "I've managed just fine for 50 years, Robert replied without bitterness. His voice was soft but clear, carrying the slight rasp of age, but none of the anger that might have been justified. The young woman, her name tag read Sarah, hovered uncertainly, clearly torn between restaurant protocol and basic human empathy. She couldn't be more than 25, Robert thought. Born decades after he'd returned home with one leg and a lifetime of classified memories. "The patio is just through those doors," she offered, gesturing toward the back of the restaurant. "I can bring you fresh coffee once you're settled." The dining room had grown even more crowded as the morning progressed. A line now stretched from the entrance, new arrivals stamping feet against the November chill as they waited for tables. Robert noticed how eyes skimmed past him, acknowledging his presence just enough to navigate around him, but never long enough to see him. It was a particular kind of invisibility that came with age and disability, one that had ceased to surprise him years ago. The route to the patio doors required navigating between tightly packed tables, a challenge for someone with Robert's limited mobility. Each step was an exercise in focus and balance, his knuckles whitening around the cane's handle as he carefully threaded his way through the crowded space. A young busboy, arms laden with dirty dishes, nearly collided with him before sidestepping at the last moment without a word of apology. Robert paused momentarily to catch his breath, using the opportunity to glance back at his now empty table. Already a server was clearing his half-finished water glass, preparing the space for guests who would be more welcomed by the establishment. He felt no resentment, just a hollow recognition of reality. The child who had asked about his unusual walk continued to stare from the safety of his father's side. Children's curiosity rarely bothered Robert. They asked questions from genuine interest, not judgment. It was the adults, with their whispers and averted gazes, who had mastered the art of inflicting small wounds with nothing more than a glance. "Daddy, did his leg get broken?" The boy persisted, his voice carrying in that piercing way of young children. "Share." The father hushed, embarrassment coloring his face. "Don't be rude." Robert caught the boy's eye and offered a small smile. "It's not broken," he said gently, "just different." The father quickly turned his son away, muttering something about not bothering that man, and steering the child toward their waiting table. Another teaching moment lost. Another opportunity to show a child that differences weren't something to fear or avoid, but simply part of the varied tapestry of human experience. As Robert approached the glass doors leading to the patio, he could see that the outdoor space was nearly deserted despite the manager's insistence that it was quite nice out. November in New Holland brought temperatures that hovered just above freezing, with a persistent wind that found every gap in one's clothing. Only 2 tables showed evidence of recent use, and both had been abandoned, coffee cups left half full, as their owners had presumably sought warmer surroundings. He pushed against the door with his shoulder, balancing precariously as he held his tray with one hand and managed his cane with the other. The cold air hit him immediately, a sharp contrast to the overheated restaurant interior. His joints, the real ones and the metal components of his prosthetic, protested simultaneously, the familiar ache intensifying as the temperature dropped. The patio furniture was clearly designed for summer use. Lightweight metal chairs with no cushions and tables too small to be practical for a full meal. Robert surveyed his options, calculating which seat would be easiest to access and, more importantly, to rise from when the time came to leave. Near the corner, partially sheltered by the building's overhang, stood a chair with slightly sturdier legs than the others. He made his way toward it with deliberate steps, each one carefully placed to avoid a fall that, at his age, could mean the end of his independence. The laughter from the table of men followed Robert like an unwelcome shadow as he pushed through the door into the chill morning air. The coldness outside somehow felt more honest than the artificial warmth of the restaurant. At least the weather made no pretense about its harshness. Robert carefully navigated across the patio's uneven brick surface, each step a calculated risk. The prosthetic leg that had been state-of-the-art in 1972 was now woefully outdated, lacking the sophisticated hydraulics and responsive joints of modern prosthetics. But the VA had determined years ago that he didn't qualify for an upgrade. His disability percentage hadn't changed despite the advancing arthritis that made each step increasingly difficult. Finding the steadiest-looking chair, Robert lowered himself slowly, placing his tray on the small metal table with practiced precision. The coffee had stopped steaming in the brief journey from inside to the patio, cooling rapidly in the November air. He wrapped his gnarled fingers around the mug, seeking whatever warmth remained. From this vantage point, he could see through the large windows into the bustling restaurant, families enjoying their meals, servers weaving between tables, the manager now smiling broadly as he seated a well-dressed couple at the table Robert had vacated just minutes before. The contrast between the lively interior and his solitary position outside wasn't lost on him. Robert's thoughts drifted back to another time he found himself on the outside looking in. December 1971, just weeks after returning stateside, still adjusting to the prosthetic leg and the phantom pain that woke him screaming most nights. He'd made his way to James's family home, wanting to deliver his friends' personal effects and share stories of James's bravery with those who had loved him. He'd stood on their porch for nearly 20 minutes, rehearsing what to say before finally ringing the doorbell. James's mother had answered, her face already bearing the permanent marks of grief. She'd looked at Robert, at his crutches and the empty space where part of his leg should have been, and something in her expression had shifted from sorrow to hardened anger. "You came back," she'd said flatly. "My son didn't." The door had closed before Robert could respond, before he could tell her how James had saved 3 men before the explosion, how he died making sure everyone else got out first, how his last words had been about coming home. Robert had left the package of James' belongings on the doorstep and limped away, understanding her anger even as it cut through him like shrapnel. Now, 54 years later, that memory still had the power to steal his breath. Robert pulled his jacket tighter against the chill, both physical and remembered. A sudden gust of wind scattered fallen leaves across the patio, sending napkins from an adjacent table fluttering to the ground. Robert watched them skitter across the bricks, too far for him to gather without considerable effort. Once, he would have immediately moved to retrieve them, his ingrained sense of order and responsibility compelling him to action. Now, he had learned to recognize the limitations of his aging body. The tear that had fallen earlier, the one solitary drop of emotion he'd allowed himself, had dried on his cheek, leaving an almost imperceptible salt trace behind. Robert Ellis hadn't cried when he lost his leg, hadn't cried when they told him James didn't make it, hadn't even cried at his wife Marian's funeral 12 years ago, standing stoic beside her grave while neighbors murmured about his apparent lack of feeling. But sometimes, in moments like this, when the accumulated weight of a lifetime's dismissals pressed down, a single tear escaped before he could marshal his defenses, not from self-pity, but from a bone-deep weariness at having to continually prove his worth to a world that had decided, at a glance, that he had none. From inside, he could hear the muffled sounds of a birthday celebration starting. Cheerful singing and applause for someone marking another year of life surrounded by those who valued their presence. Robert took a sip of his cold coffee and focused instead on the sky above, noticing how the clouds were beginning to part, revealing patches of clear blue. His annual pilgrimage to honor James had become something different today, another reminder of his increasing invisibility. Yet even as he acknowledged this truth, Robert's military training reasserted itself. Adapt and overcome. Find the strategic advantage in any situation. Here at least he had solitude and fresh air. No one watching him struggle with cutting his food or grimacing when pain shot through his hip. He straightened his back slightly, an echo of the perfect posture drilled into him during basic training 6 decades earlier. The movement sent a familiar ache through his spine, but he maintained the position. Some habits remained unbreakable, some principles unshakable, regardless of circumstance or audience. A sparrow landed on the edge of his table, cocking its head inquisitively at the crumbs of toast on his plate. Robert smiled faintly and deliberately broke off a small piece, placing it at the edge of the table for his unexpected companion. The tiny bird darted forward, snatched the offering, and retreated to a safer distance before consuming its prize. "At least you are not picky about the company you keep," Robert murmured, his voice barely audible of the wind. Jackson Miles had entered the restaurant through the back entrance, a habit from his military training. Always assess all entry and exit points. He had planned to grab a quick breakfast before meeting with his former mentor across town, his rare leave time carefully scheduled to maximize connections with family and colleagues. The young SEAL hadn't expected to find himself frozen in place, staring at a faded tattoo on an elderly man's wrist. The dagger through an anchor design wasn't something civilians would recognize as significant, but to someone like Jackson, it might as well have been a neon sign. That specific insignia had been shown to them during a specialized history module at training, the mark of an elite unit whose extraction and logistics protocols had revolutionized special operations. Jackson had spent years studying those protocols. His instructor, Commander Phillips, had drilled the patterns into them, explaining how these methods had saved his father's life in 1970. "These weren't created by some desk jockey," Phillips would say. "These came from men who understood the ground reality and improvised solutions that became doctrine." And now, incredibly, Jackson was looking at one of those very men, relegated to the outside patio of a busy restaurant, alone with a cooling breakfast and decades of unrecognized service. For a moment, Jackson hesitated. Military protocol dictated respect for superior officers. But this wasn't a military setting, and the elderly man wasn't in uniform. Yet something deeper than protocol compelled Jackson forward, a sense of connection to the lineage of service that had shaped his own path. As he approached, Jackson noted the details a civilian might miss: the way the old man continuously scanned his surroundings, the precise placement of his cane within easy reach, the straight back despite obvious physical discomfort. These weren't conscious behaviors but ingrained habits from years of operational awareness, muscle memory that outlasted the missions themselves. "Excuse me, sir," Jackson began, his voice steady despite the unexpected emotion rising in his chest. "Were you with SEAL Team Bravo, 1960s deployment?" When Robert looked up, the surprise in his eyes was evident, not just at being addressed, but at being recognized for something he had carried silently for so long. The weathered face showed momentary confusion before settling into cautious acknowledgement. "Long time ago, but yes. Logistics and extraction planning." The humility in that response, reducing years of critical service to its most basic description, struck Jackson deeply. This man had helped create the foundational strategies that modern teams still relied upon. Yet he described his role as matter-of-factly as if he'd been delivering mail. Without hesitation, Jackson snapped to attention, delivering a formal military salute that felt inadequate for the magnitude of respect he wanted to convey. "Sir, your extraction protocols saved my instructor's father. They still teach us your techniques at training. You're LSG-7, aren't you?" The designation, part of the classified naming system used for that particular unit, clearly startled Robert. Few people outside the most specialized military circles would know it. For 5 decades, he had been simply Robert Ellis, the quiet mechanic with one leg and a small auto shop. Being recognized by his operational designation was like hearing a language he had thought long forgotten. "How do you?" Robert began, then stopped, visibly processing this unexpected turn of events. His weathered hands that had once assembled communication equipment under enemy fire, that had drawn extraction routes on makeshift maps, that had carried wounded comrades, trembled slightly against the metal table. Jackson maintained his posture of respect. Commander Phillips at training. His father was in the Quang Tri Province extraction. Your team got them out when conventional methods failed. Robert's eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing through the years to that particular mission. "We lost 2 men getting those boys out," he said quietly. "Radio operator and point man. good men. Their sacrifice is part of our training now, sir, Jackson replied. The adaptive routing technique you developed during that extraction is standard procedure. They call it the Ellis bypass in the field manuals. A flicker of pride, quickly tempered by humility, crossed Robert's face. We just did what needed doing. Nothing special about it. The wind had picked up again, sending a chill across the patio. Jackson noted how Robert's jacket seemed inadequate for the temperature, how the elderly man's fingers had a slight bluish tinge from the cold. Sir, would you allow me to join you? Or perhaps we could continue this conversation inside where it's warmer. Robert glanced toward the restaurant windows, his expression suggesting he didn't feel particularly welcome there. They made it clear they preferred me out here. Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was too disciplined to show anger openly. But the implication that this man, this living piece of unit history, had been relegated to the cold patio struck a nerve. With respect, sir, I believe that situation can be rectified. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to having his authority recognized, despite his relatively young age. Your service deserves better acknowledgement than this. For the first time that morning, something close to hope flickered in Robert's eyes. Not hope for recognition or special treatment, but the simple human hope of being seen as who he truly was rather than what he appeared to be. The restaurant's ambient noise dropped to a murmur as Jackson's words registered with the surrounding patrons. His commanding presence and formal military bearing created a natural focal point that drew attention from across the room. The four men who had been mockingly discussing Robert now sat uncomfortably still, their expressions shifting between embarrassment and disbelief. Jackson continued, his voice clear and measured, carrying the weight of authentic respect. Mr. Ellis was part of a specialized team that operated when missions didn't make the history books. The extraction techniques he pioneered under hostile conditions are still saving lives today. The restaurant manager approached cautiously, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Is everything all right over here? Jackson turned slightly, his posture remaining formal. Sir, I'd like to know why a decorated veteran was asked to relocate to the outdoor seating area on a cold day when there are clearly tables available inside. The manager's expression faltered. There was a misunderstanding. We had a complaint from us, interrupted one of the men from the center table, standing up. Unlike moments before, his voice had lost its mocking edge. We made assumptions that were incorrect. Jackson acknowledged this with a slight nod before turning back to the manager. I believe Mr. Ellis deserves an apology and proper accommodation. During this exchange, Robert remained seated, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. For decades, he had carried his experiences quietly, never seeking recognition or special treatment. This sudden spotlight, this unexpected advocacy, left him both touched and uncomfortable. This really isn't necessary, he began, but Jackson respectfully held up a hand. With all due respect, sir, it is necessary. Not just for you, but for all of us here today. An elderly woman who had been quietly dining with her husband nearby rose slowly to her feet. My brother was in Vietnam, she said, her voice wavering slightly. He came home changed. No one ever knew what he did there, but he carried it with him every day until he passed. She turned toward Robert and nodded once, a simple gesture laden with understanding. Her action sparked a chain reaction. A middle-aged man in a business suit stood next, then a young couple near the window, then a woman dining alone in the corner. Within moments, nearly half the restaurant had risen in a silent show of respect that transcended words. The manager, reading the room correctly, quickly recovered his professional composure. Mr. Ellis, please allow us to offer you our best table and a fresh meal, on the house of course. Robert shook his head slightly, the corner of his mouth turning up in what might have been the beginning of a smile. That's not necessary. I don't need special treatment. It's not special treatment, sir, Jackson replied. It's appropriate treatment. From the entrance, a new voice joined the conversation. Dad always said the real heroes never asked for recognition. All eyes turned to see an older woman in a police uniform, the local sheriff, based on her insignia, standing just inside the door. I'm Sheriff Donovan. My father served with the 101st Airborne. He told me the quietest men often carried the heaviest burdens. She approached Robert and Jackson, her presence adding another layer of authority to the moment. Thank you both for your service to our country. It's an honor to have you in our town. The four men who had been mocking Robert earlier now looked thoroughly chastened. One of them, appearing to wrestle with his conscience, finally approached. Sir, he began, addressing Robert directly, I owe you an apology. My words were disrespectful, and I was wrong. He extended his hand tentatively. Robert looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Throughout his life, he had faced countless slights, dismissals, and misunderstandings. He had endured them all with stoic dignity, never demanding apologies or recognition. But something about this moment, perhaps Jackson's presence, perhaps the unexpected support from strangers, gave him permission to accept what he had long been denied. He reached out and shook the man's hand firmly. Apology accepted. The simple exchange seemed to release the tension in the room. Conversations gradually resumed, though with a more subdued, respectful tone than before. The manager personally escorted Robert and Jackson to a table in the main dining area, not ostentatiously front and center, which would have embarrassed the humble veteran, but a comfortable corner spot that offered both privacy and dignity. As they settled in, Robert's gaze met Jackson's. Thank you, he said simply. Not many would have taken the time. Sir, the honor is entirely mine, Jackson replied with genuine respect. The techniques you developed have been part of my training since day one. They're the difference between success and failure in critical situations. A young server, not Sarah from earlier, but a different young woman, approached with fresh coffee and menus. Good morning, gentlemen. It's a privilege to serve you both today. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, without the artificial deference that sometimes accompanies service industry interactions. She poured the coffee with careful attention, then stepped back respectfully. Please take your time with the menus. Today's specials are listed on the insert. As she departed, Robert looked around the restaurant with new awareness. The patrons who had stood in respect had returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Occasional glances in their direction now carried curiosity and respect rather than dismissal or mockery. You've disrupted their morning routine, Robert observed with gentle humor. People don't know quite what to do with themselves now. Jackson smiled. Sometimes routines need disruption, sir, particularly when they've allowed important things to go unnoticed. As Robert and Jackson settled into conversation, Sarah, the young waitress who had earlier asked Robert to move, watched from across the restaurant, her expression a mixture of shame and curiosity. Finally, gathering her courage, she approached their table with a fresh pot of coffee. May I refill your cups? She asked, her voice carrying a tentative note. Robert nodded, offering a gentle smile that contained no hint of resentment. Thank you. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she poured, causing a few drops to spill onto the tablecloth. I'm so sorry about this and about before. I should have stood up to them instead of asking you to move. You were doing your job, Robert replied simply. Jackson observed the interaction closely, noting the genuine remorse in the young woman's demeanor. There was something else there too, a curiosity that seemed personal rather than merely polite. Sarah hesitated, then spoke again. When you mentioned Vietnam earlier, it made me wonder. My grandfather served there. He never talked about it much before he passed. Robert's expression softened further. Many didn't. What was his name? James Harrington, she replied, the name hanging in the air between them like a physical presence. My mom says he was in some special unit, but all his records were classified. We don't even have many photos. The coffee cup in Robert's hand froze midway to his lips. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, decades of carefully contained emotions threatening to surface all at once. Jackson, sensing the significance of the moment, remained respectfully silent. "Your grandfather," Robert finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was the bravest man I ever knew." Sarah's eyes widened. "You knew him? Really knew him?" Robert set down his cup carefully, his weathered hands now visibly trembling. "We served together. Same unit." He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Would you like to sit for a moment, if your manager allows?" Sarah glanced toward the counter, where the manager, now keenly aware of the situation, nodded his permission. She sat down, her movements cautious as if afraid this connection might somehow break if she moved too quickly. "All my life, he's been just this shadow," she said. "Mom was only 7 when he died. Grandma had a few stories, but she passed when I was 14. There's just so little of him left." Robert reached for his wallet, his fingers working with deliberate care to extract a worn photograph protected by a plastic sleeve. The simple action seemed to require immense effort, not physically but emotionally, as if he were unveiling something precious and vulnerable. "I've carried this since 1971, he explained, gently placing the photograph on the table between them. Sarah leaned forward, her breath catching as she looked at the image of 2 young soldiers, one tall with an easy smile, the other more serious, both bearing the unmistakable intensity of men operating in dangerous circumstances. "That's him," she whispered, touching the edge of the plastic reverently. "That's my grandfather." Robert nodded. James talked about this restaurant constantly. Showed everyone that little photo he carried of the place. "Best burgers in New Holland," he'd say. "When we get home, first round's on me." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "So that's why you come here? For Veterans Day?" "Every year," Robert confirmed quietly. "Different restaurants other days, but always here on November 11th. Keeping a promise between friends." Jackson, witnessing this extraordinary connection unfolding, maintained a respectful silence. His training had prepared him for many situations, but nothing quite like the profound convergence of past and present occurring before him. "He saved my life," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared memories long held private. "Not just the day we hit that mine, but a dozen times before. He had an instinct for danger, could sense an ambush before anyone else noticed anything wrong." Sarah wiped at her eyes, hungry for every detail. "Mom says his letters home never mentioned anything dangerous. He wrote about the weather, the food, missing home." "That was James," Robert smiled faintly. "Always protecting everyone else from worry. He carried the heaviest burdens so others wouldn't have to." From her apron pocket, Sarah produced her phone. "I have one picture of him from before he deployed. My mom scanned all the family photos last year." She navigated to the image and showed Robert. A younger James in his dress uniform, standing proudly beside a young woman. "Your grandmother," Robert identified immediately. "He showed us that picture so many times we teased him about wearing it out. He was so proud of her, so excited to start their life together when his tour ended." Sarah's next question came hesitantly, laden with the weight of family history. Were you there when he died?" The restaurant seemed to grow quieter, though in reality the ambient noise continued unchanged. Robert took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Sarah's directly. "I was. We were clearing a supply route, just 8 miles from extraction. James was point man because he had the best instincts. I was navigating." Robert paused, the memory still vivid after all these years. "The medic was working on my leg when they brought him over." His last words were about getting everyone home safe. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek. "Thank you for telling me. No one ever told me exactly what happened." "Your grandfather died making sure everyone else got out," Robert said firmly. "That's who he was, in Vietnam and before. Everything he did, he did for others. Sarah reached across the table impulsively, grasping Robert's hand. Would you tell me more? About him, about what you both did? Mom would want to know. We all would. Robert's eyes, which had remained dry through the entire exchange despite the emotion evident in his voice, now glistened slightly. I'd be honored to. The transformation of Robert Ellis's life after that fateful Veterans Day unfolded with a momentum that surprised everyone, most of all Robert himself. What began as a simple encounter rippled outward, touching lives throughout the community and beyond. 3 days after the newspaper article appeared, Robert opened his front door to find 12 letters from local schoolchildren, each containing hand-drawn pictures and heartfelt messages. Thank you for being a hero, one read in careful crayon lettering. My grandpa was a soldier too, said another. The simple sincerity of these messages affected Robert more deeply than any formal recognition ever could. By the following week, visitors began appearing at his modest home, veterans from different eras who had read the story and felt compelled to connect. They came not with grand gestures, but with quiet understanding, often sitting on Robert's small porch sharing coffee and the unspoken kinship that exists between those who have served. Sarah Harrington brought her mother, James's daughter, to meet Robert the following Sunday. The meeting was emotional yet healing, bridging a gap of 5 decades. Melissa Harrington had grown up with only fragments of her father's story, raised by a mother who had struggled with her own grief. Robert's detailed memories of James, his humor, his loyalty, his small habits and quirks, gave Melissa a fuller picture of the father she had lost as a child. He always folded his letters in a specific way, Robert told her, demonstrating with a napkin. 3 precise folds, then he'd smooth each crease with his thumb. Said his father taught him that proper correspondence showed respect for the recipient. Melissa wiped away tears. I have every letter he sent. They're all folded exactly like that. The town's response evolved beyond mere curiosity into something more meaningful. The owner of the hardware store where Robert occasionally purchased supplies refused payment when Robert came in for a new doorknob. Your money's no good here anymore, Ellis, he said gruffly, his way of showing respect without sentimentality. Jackson, true to his word, maintained contact through regular letters. His handwritten correspondence arrived like clockwork on the 1st of each month, detailing his training activities and occasionally asking Robert's opinion on tactical scenarios. These letters became treasured connections to the world Robert had once inhabited, a world where his knowledge and experience still held value. The real change, however, came through Robert's small auto repair shop. Though officially closed years earlier when arthritis had limited his ability to perform intricate repairs, the space had remained intact, a time capsule of tools and equipment. Now, with renewed purpose, Robert reopened it, not as a business, but as a gathering place. It began with one Vietnam veteran bringing his grandson to meet Robert and see the shop. The boy, interested in mechanics, asked questions about the tools. Robert found himself demonstrating basic techniques, his gnarled hands still capable of teaching if not performing. The following week, they returned with another family, and soon a pattern emerged. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons became unofficial workshop sessions, where Robert taught neighborhood children basic mechanical skills, while veterans of different generations gathered in the corner, drinking coffee from a pot that was always kept full. No one called it therapy, but the healing that occurred in that oil-scented space was undeniable. For the children, it was an opportunity to learn practical skills and hear stories from history that textbooks never captured. For the veterans, it was a rare space where they could simply be, without explanation, without judgment, without the expectation to move on from experiences that had shaped them fundamentally. The Hidden Heroes ceremony in the spring became an annual tradition, growing each year to recognize veterans whose contributions had occurred behind the scenes: the medics, the mechanics, the communications specialists, the logisticians. Robert attended reluctantly the first year, uncomfortable with attention, but understanding the importance of representation for those whose service often went unacknowledged. When asked to speak, he had indeed said simply, "I'm just someone who tried to help bring everyone home." The brevity and humility of this statement resonated far more powerfully than any lengthy speech could have. On Robert's 85th birthday, Jackson arrived with 7 young SEALs and a purpose. They had come not merely to celebrate, but to document. With Robert's permission, they recorded hours of his recollections about techniques and adaptations his team had developed in the field, practical knowledge that formal training couldn't provide. "This isn't just history, sir," Jackson explained. "These are life-saving insights that could be lost. Your experiences, particularly in extraction planning under compromised conditions, fill gaps in our current protocols." The following month, the Naval Special Warfare Command incorporated a new training module based on Robert's expertise, officially acknowledging the source as Ellis methodology, field-tested extraction protocols from Vietnam-era operations. Sarah Harrington, who had kept in regular contact with Robert, brought her own children to meet him regularly, ensuring James's legacy continued through generations. Her oldest son, now considering military service himself, looked to Robert as a mentor and living connection to his great-grandfather. On a crisp autumn morning 3 years later, when Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep, the community's response was immediate and profound. The small chapel could not contain the hundreds who gathered to pay respects. Active military personnel in dress uniforms stood alongside mechanics in work clothes, schoolchildren beside elderly veterans, all united in honoring a man who had asked for nothing but given immeasurably. Jackson, now an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center, led the honor guard that carried Robert's casket. The flag that draped it was later presented to Sarah's family, along with a letter from the Secretary of the Navy acknowledging Robert's contributions to current operational protocols. The small auto shop was preserved as a community space, its walls now displaying photographs and memorabilia, not just from Robert's service, but from veterans throughout the town. The plaque outside bearing the dagger-through-anchor insignia became an unofficial landmark, with new visitors often asking about its significance. Each Veterans Day, a quiet ceremony takes place at Robert's grave. It begins with Jackson or another active duty SEAL placing a coin on the headstone, an old military tradition signifying that a comrade has visited. Then Sarah or one of her children reads a passage chosen from James Harrington's letters home. Finally, in a ritual that would have embarrassed yet deeply moved Robert, attendees share stories of quiet acts of service they have performed or witnessed throughout the year. The epitaph on his simple headstone, "His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives," continues to inspire visitors to consider the deeper, often unspoken impacts of a life lived with integrity and purpose. But perhaps the most fitting tribute exists in the training manuals of special operations teams, where extraction protocols still bear the designation Ellis Method, ensuring that long after his passing, Robert continues to help bring everyone home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.